that work in our community, that have things to share and resources, and information. And so today, I believe first we have Sarah. Sarah is with the Normal Police Department, and Sarah's got some wonderful things that she is going to share with us today. So, Sarah, the floor is all yours. And when you're done, we'll be able to open up for anybody that would have some questions for you. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Langston. I appreciate the opportunity to to be a part of this. I know maybe having a police department is a little bit strange, but my role is very different here. So I had explained to everyone my title is intervention specialist, but who knows what that means? I don't even know half the time. But my role here is actually I'm a licensed clinician, mental health provider in the state of Illinois. And the newest chief, who's been on for just about a year and a half now, had really made wellness kind of a priority. And so wanting officers, and then by extension, the community, to really be thinking about how we can take better care of ourselves physically, emotionally, just kind of given the environment. So a little bit about my background. My background is in forensic psychology. So that's anywhere that the law and psychology kind of come together. So there's not a whole lot of programs out there, but it's something that's always been interesting to me. So primarily my experience has been in work with trauma and families and youth, but also worked in the community. I've worked in probation. A lot of my work was actually up north in the Chicagoland area. I'm originally from Central Illinois, and lived up there for about 20 years. And then several years ago, had moved back down to be closer to family, and kind of pursuing this passion of helping the helpers per se. And so when this new role came about at the police department, I was obviously very interested in what the purpose of my job is to do is primarily, at least at the current time, providing support to officers. Doing this work, doing any type of work with people can be demanding, and really kind of change the perspective. And so part of what I'm doing is helping officers just kind of become more self-aware and self-reflective of the impact that the work can have on them, and then by extension, their families and the communities. I've been able to work on collecting resources, providing that to officers and their family to, again, make sure that we're taking care of ourselves both physically and emotionally. I think what's been really interesting is through my conversations with folks here, and I shouldn't say I'm working just with officers, it's everybody is welcome to come in, and I'm certainly willing to talk with anybody. But as I'm kind of teaching them things about kind of mental health and how our brains and how our bodies respond to stress or to joy, it's been very interesting to kind of see light bulb moments like, oh, well, this explains a lot about how my kid is, or, oh, I really use that tool that we talked about when I was out on a call. I found that really helpful. And so kind of giving people information and giving people knowledge has been really, I think, powerful to understanding themselves better, and then understanding how we're all human beings and we all function similarly in some aspects, biologically, certainly. So I think that's been really helpful and eye-opening when it comes to just different ways to engage with people. Some of my other responsibilities have kind of been a little bit of a liaison for community members, and this is primarily folks who seem to be struggling to be linked with resources. And so I've been really appreciative to be a part of groups like this, and on the Ross calls that Kat facilitates, to really kind of make sure that I'm able to provide officers with a robust range of services that they can then pass along to folks who may need it. Not all of them right now. The goal is to have all of the officers here trained in what's called crisis intervention training, so that they're getting more formal kind of understanding and training on dealing specifically with what mental illness can look like, or maybe what's a better way to respond to someone in crisis. And my role is kind of to support some of that, and my goal is to also become a trainer of that model as well. What else did I want to mention about my role here? I think it's really just also teaching people how to kind of support each other. This culture is very much kind of a culture where we don't talk about things like feelings, or there's been a stigma of, I'm going to lose my job if I talk about I'm having a hard time. And so we're working really hard to change that and to really normalize kind of talking about if you feel off or something's bothering you, and just taking care of each other. We really are big on, we take care of ourselves, we take care of each other, and then that really trickles down. Not to suggest that hasn't been happening, but just reminding people, it's okay to reach out and talk to somebody else, whether that's a peer or that's me or that's somebody outside of here, that police officers are human beings too. I know that's not always the perception, but the job that the officers are tasked with, there's a lot of demand and a lot of expectations on that, and that can be difficult sometimes to kind of stifle some of your feelings in the moment, but those things have got to go somewhere. And so really giving people an opportunity to have more healthy outlets for that, versus kind of keeping that inside. I don't know if folks here are aware, but the suicide rates for the first responder world is about 3 times that of the general population. And so clearly there's something that needs to be addressed here. And so that's one of the things we're trying to tackle is, kind of changing that culture. And if you need help, and not saying that it has to be that kind of extreme where someone might be considering harming themselves, but it does happen, and let's get in front of that so that we can kind of prevent things from getting to that point. So we talk a lot about shifting our mindset to, instead of what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. I know that might be bordering on cliche anymore for those who are working in the mental health field. There's been a lot of talk about that, especially with the whole Bruce Perry, Oprah Winfrey interview, but he does have a book about that. It's very, got a lot of interesting information in there if anybody's interested in that. But it really is a powerful kind of reframe to thinking about someone who might be in crisis, and a way to open the door to kind of talk about things is there's not something inherently wrong with you, but it's what's happened that you're responding that way. And that's one of those kind of other just slight shifts in thinking and speaking that's been pretty powerful for officers to think about too when they're working with folks. A big part of the work can seem like go, 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 and many of us feel that way, right? I think our culture is very much in kind of hyper speed. So our focus has been kind of slow things down whenever possible. When we have the opportunity to kind of think and process information a little bit, then we tend to be able to calm ourselves down if we need to, make more rational thoughts. Not everything has to be, or rational decisions, not everything has to be in hyper speed. And I think sometimes we feel that as a demand culturally, that we're in this moment of everything is accessible at a minute's notice. And that's not really how we're wired to work, is to function that way. So it takes some practice to really slow down and practice to take care of ourselves. And that's kind of one of the big things that I've tried to promote is that. One of the other big things in kind of talking about trauma in education that I've done is talking about trauma as an injury, because it really is. Trauma is shaping and shifting how your brain is functioning, how you're seeing the world. And so we spent some time talking, and I'm not going to bore everybody here with that. We spend a lot of time doing some trainings and talking about the impact that trauma can have on our brains, and then how we then perceive our relationships, perceive our world, and then how physically that can sit in our body for a prolonged period of time. And certainly officers see quite a bit of that. It's pretty rare that somebody's calling the police to say, hey, I'm having the best day of my life, come join me. It's usually the opposite. And so I think it's important to help officers also see that 100% of their day is often about 10% of what we all, as the general public, see on a daily basis. And so helping them kind of take a step outside of that world, but also understand that in other people, trauma affects all of us differently, but many people have experienced trauma, and here's how it can look, especially if it is something that has been untreated. And I think that's been really helpful, and something that the officers have really wanted more understanding of and more knowledge about is, what does that look like? and really trying to understand that oftentimes in their interaction, they're only scratching the surface. They're only seeing a very small part of something that's much bigger, yet the significance of the interaction can also really shape how someone continues to see the world or engage with others, or can help kind of disrupt maybe a dysfunctional pattern that is in there. So understanding that their role can be critical. And we've talked a lot about in a moment when the police are called, someone's often in a heightened emotional state. And we talk about how our functioning is we call it state dependent. I know that's very jargony. But basically, how our moods and our ability to understand and speak with people fluctuates and varies. And it can be from moment to moment. However, it's important to understand that we need for people to be regulated and feel safe to be able to engage. If you think about somebody trying to work with this came actually as an example in a training. Said, I want you parents to think about what it's like when you tell your screaming toddler to just calm down and stop talking. Usually doesn't work. You have to do something to help calm them down before you're able to have a conversation. Well, we're all like that. And so we've talked about ways that officers can do that, interventions that they can give other folks that are very regulating. And so kind of talking about and reminding people that you can't just say, calm down. It hasn't worked for you in the past. It's going to continue to not work for you. You have to really help people kind of, we call co-regulate. And so that's been a fun and interesting avenue to go down with some of the officers. But again, we focused a lot on physiological responses to extreme stress, trauma, and giving people resources to kind of cope with that. And then kind of finally trying to wrap things up and not talk everyone's ear off. I'm also working on building up resources that are maybe different or emerging areas. So outside of maybe traditional talk therapy. So I know there's a group of providers in the area who are working on things like breathing work. There's some body work clinicians who, and I think when we hear body work, we think more things like massage or yoga, and those are absolutely effective or can be effective interventions. But there are also things that are known as myofascial therapies, there's sound therapies, there's a lot of kind of emerging things and resources that are in this area. And so part of a group that's kind of trying to build that up and then get that information more out there, because many of us know, with trauma work, it's not necessarily a one size fits all. There's some things that have been researched and shown to be particularly effective with trauma and people experiencing a lot of symptoms. However, we know that each person is also uniquely different as well. And so we really need to tailor that. So working with that group of folks to kind of get their information out there and to really just be as a community helping each other out and supporting each other. So that's kind of really all I had. I don't know if anybody has questions, concerns, suggestions.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for just sharing all of that with us. That's really great. I think dealing with untreated trauma is very important. It was a huge part of my re-entering back into the community, and just me being able to change my life around was going back and dealing with the untreated trauma in my life. Does anybody have any just questions for Sarah, comments?
I was gonna say, it looks like Malachi has raised his hand.
Malachi.
Yay. Hey, how's it going?
Hi.
How you doing, Sarah?
Well, thank you.
So, so I work for Defy Ventures, and we are an organization that steps into 3 prisons, and we teach entrepreneurship to people who are, returning home to citizenship. I myself am a returning citizen. I've been home for about a year. First off, I want to just applaud you for everything that you just said, because I find that it is kind of uniquely difficult to get people to understand the perspective that you just laid out, especially when you're talking about trauma.
Yeah.
Because I had to unpack my own traumas. I didn't realize what I had to deal with because I served 24 years. I was guilty, right? Like, I didn't hold law enforcement as my enemy because I committed the crime, right? And so I'm saying all that to say that I applaud you for what you just said, because that's what I've been out here doing, trying to build mental health spaces for us so that we can unpack that trauma. And uniquely, we can use that for people who have never been justice impacted, because there's pre-trauma, pre-prison trauma, post-release trauma, and during incarceration trauma, right? And then on the other side of the fence, you have to understand that corrections officers, police officers, fire department, EITs, all of them experience their own trauma, because when you're talking about violence and all these unnatural things that happen in these settings, right? Everyone is affected, right? Not just and God forbid, the victims, yes, the people who suffer, but everyone involved is infected, right? Because as me being someone who committed a crime, I understand that part of my soul was tarnished by taking a life, right? And so that affected me in ways I couldn't have even foresaw. And so I try to help people on my side of the fence to say, listen, we have to meet people in the middle ground. You have to stop looking at police officers simply as being your enemy, because that's where the problem happens. Like, I have a special relationship with corrections, with certain police commanders. And what we do is we try to get ahead of the violence. We try to get ahead of, okay, how do we stop these people, these kids specifically, from committing these crimes? But we have to have these conversations, and we have to be vulnerable enough to say, this is what hurt me, this is what affected me, and this is why I respond, correlating to what you were just talking about. And I love the fact that you all are being so progressive and proactive, because a lot of people don't want to talk about because they're like, oh, that's just you whining about something. It's like, no, the reality is I was affected by this at 10 years old, and this is why I continue to respond like that. But as an adult, I understand that. And then moving in spaces where people who don't understand it, we can talk about it, help them move from that. So that way, the next time they're stopped by a police officer, they're not like, oh my God, let me take off and run, or oh my God, let me attack this officer, because you don't know what their experience is. So I'm just saying all that to say, I applaud you. Thank you. I'm telling you what you just said is relevant and it works. Please continue to do it, because
thank you.
I'm doing the same thing. So.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, that stuff is also hard. I think as a culture here, we have a long way to go, but we're just now finally accepting. And maybe this is one of the silver linings that we'll learn from COVID, but we can't escape that was traumatic, for so many people, and we got to do something about it, because we're seeing the impacts and what we were doing by pushing things down or stigmatizing, taking care of each other and talking about that, it wasn't working, and so we got to do something different. So I appreciate that. And likewise, the work that you've done with yourself, which has probably been very hard. And I like to tell people too, this isn't, nothing is going to be a quick fix. It's hard and it takes time, and we take time and we do it right. We will overcome together. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Trudy has her hand raised also.
Yeah, Trudy.
Yes. I wanted to know, how do we find a therapist providing trauma therapy? I've never really had like any bad experiences with the police or anything, but I left my house yesterday morning and there were like 2 or 3 police cars across the street from my house. And I'm like, uh-oh, like, what's going on? I want to know what's going on, but I got to get out of here and go to work. But how do I find therapists, even for some of our participants who may need some trauma therapy?
That is a great question. And what I can do is I can drop some names of providers or ways that you can find people who practice specific types of trauma therapy. So there are people who get trained and get a certification in something called trauma-focused CBT. There is EMDR, which is a specific type of trauma treatment as well that requires a certification, extra training, and several of those things. And I just realized I said CBT and I meant to say cognitive behavioral therapy. But there are listings where you can actually type in, a zip code or a town, and it will give you a list of those providers. I also want to be aware of and attuned to that not necessarily all those providers accept, like public aid. I want to be cognizant of, we have a wide range of needs in the community, and we need a wide range of providers that have this specialization, but then can also work with people on whatever their funding sources, and maybe that sliding scale, or pro bono. So I can drop some links in the comment box, or I don't know if it's possible if there's an email list that I can send things out to as well, that I can absolutely throw that out there as a starting point. I know a place that I've started with some of the officers here is working with who is our insurance provider. And granted, the website for them is often clunky and not user friendly, but I kind of walk through that with them and like, hey, here's the people who are covered by the insurance that we have. And some of them I know and I can vouch for. I can make suggestions if they're willing to say, I'll just pay per session. I will not go on too much of a tangent with this, and I won't stay on my pulpit for too long, but I really would like to push that, especially in people doing responder work or even healthcare, where part of the job expectation is that you are regularly exposed to traumatic events and trauma, that should be covered like any other benefit. But I know we're a little ways from that, and I will not go too far on my pulpit about that. But I think we can do better at taking care of the folks who we deliberately, like, it is their job to be traumatized, essentially.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
You guys, thank you. This is all really great information. Whenever we get on this topic, I always, try to just remember that, as the McLean County Reentry Council, our focus is, people that are coming home from incarceration, and that's a tough line to walk, trying to, decipher between correctional officers and police officers, people that have been incarcerated, especially for a long period of time. In their mind, law enforcement, are like correctional officers, and correctional officers, they don't always have the best, history. I mean, there's correctional officers in there that, can do some pretty bad stuff. And so when people are approached by law enforcement officers, when they're back in the community, their mind, that trauma that they went through being incarcerated, they automatically relate police officers to correctional officers. And so it's really great for the law enforcement, to understand when they are dealing with someone that's, been gone for a while. And approach them in a different manner than a correctional officer would. This is great. So if anyone else has any questions for Sarah, we'll take them now, and then we'll be ready to move on and see what Emily's got going on.
That would be Kat. Kat has her hand raised.
Oh, Kat, there you go.
Not really a question, more of a plug. A great brand new resource within the last 2 or 3 weeks that has opened for anybody who is seeking mental health or substance use recovery support is a New Horizon Recovery Community Center at the Center for Human Services. They just opened. They're a little bit minimal on classes right now, but they're working on building up their programming. They do a spiritual talk. I think they do education on substance use. They've got some easy Tai Chi classes, and these are free for people who want to participate. And they will walk people through looking at increasing their recovery capital. And the idea on that is they will go through an assessment and work with people on what do you want to work on in your recovery today.
No, that's fantastic. They must have been here because I saw their flyer literally this morning. And so we're putting that in our list of resources for officers to give out too. So thank you for bringing that up, because it sounds great.
Thank you, Kat.
Sarah, I also put the Reentry Council Secretary's email in the chat. So anyone that has any information to go out to the group, she'll get that to it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, guys. I believe next we have Emily. Emily is from Prairie State Legal Services, and she's got some awesome information that she's going to share with us. So, Emily, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, and thanks for having me here today. I just going to see if I can share my screen. It doesn't look like it, which is totally fine. So I just wanted to join today to give just a really
You
brief
should be able
overview.
to share now. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, that's okay. No problem. Sometimes it helps to have things to look at. There it is. All right. All right. Can you see my slideshow?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes.
You can see it. Okay. Yeah, when I'm sharing my screen, I can't see you all. So just let me know. Let me know if there's a problem. So today I just wanted to give a brief overview of Prairie State Legal Services, our general services, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about our Fair Housing Project, trying to make sure that all individuals are able to access housing, safe housing without discrimination. And live in the housing that they're currently in without facing discrimination. And so my name, as I said earlier, is Emily Petri. I'm a supervising attorney in the Bloomington office of Prairie State Legal Services. We have to put a disclaimer in all our presentations that this isn't legal advice. And our Fair Housing Project is funded by the City of Bloomington and Town of Normal, and we like to acknowledge those funders when we talk about our fair housing work, because the city and the town have both supported our work that we're doing on fair housing issues. So Prairie State's mission is to ensure equal access to justice and fair treatment under the law by providing legal advice and representation, advocacy, education, and outreach, focusing on protecting basic human needs and enforcing or upholding rights. We have 11 offices serving 36 counties. In Bloomington, we serve McLean County. We also serve Woodford County and Livingston County. And we don't charge fees for our services. And so our basic guidelines is we are serving individuals who have lower income or who are survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault, or persons who are aged 60 or older. We also have some other funding that gives us a little bit more flexibility to serve people who have income that's over 200% of the federal poverty level. So generally, we encourage people to contact us and apply for our legal services, and we work it out on our end because we have a lot of different funding sources to be able to serve different people with different legal issues. And as I said previously, we don't charge fees for our legal services. So all of our services are provided at no cost. Some of our clients do have to pay, depending on their income, filing fees and things like that if their income is a little bit higher. But for the most part, there aren't any fees associated with our services or with our representation of individuals in court. So I mentioned this previously. We serve people ages 60 and over, people with disabilities, survivors of domestic violence, individuals with limited income, veterans. To access our services, generally, a person needs to have a legal status in the United States, or if it's a person who is a survivor of domestic violence, we don't need any documentation of status in the United States. And so again, that's something we work out on our end. But if an individual is applying for services, that's just one of our requirements that comes through our funding from the federal government. So what do we help with? As I mentioned previously at Prairie State, we are focusing our legal services. We provide civil legal services. So we don't practice criminal law, which is usually a big question, or traffic cases, things like that. But we provide civil legal services. And here's a list of the types of cases that we help with. So we, as I mentioned, we help survivors of domestic violence get orders of protection. We can also help survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault with longer term court cases, right? Like divorce cases or custody cases. We can also help with housing problems that are related to a domestic violence situation. We also help people who are the victims of elder abuse or financial exploitation. We help people that are having issues with their Medicaid benefits, their Medicare benefits, or other public benefits like supplemental security income, which is SSI, their food stamps, SNAP benefit, if people have TANF benefits, veterans assistance, their housing choice vouchers through the Housing Authority. Those are all benefits that if someone has applied for and is denied, or is on the program but then is threatened with a termination or getting kicked off the program, there's usually a right to appeal. And so we help people with those appeals. They're usually administrative, but we'll help people and advocate for people to get the benefit that they're entitled to under the rules of those programs, right? Or sometimes I'm thinking particularly of in the SNAP context or Social Security context, people will get notices that they were overpaid, right? They got too much benefit, too much money, and now they owe money back to the state, right? Or to the federal government. And so we help people try to resolve that too, and work out unravel what happened, and who was at fault, who owes what do the documents show, and if they do owe it, can something get worked out as far as maybe paying back from their current benefit instead of having to pay some type of lump sum. We also help people in the housing context. So we help people who are facing evictions, who have gotten an eviction notice, or who have gotten an eviction notice and then ended up in court on an eviction. We help people who are living in situations where their landlord's not maintaining their housing, right? In a really bad way, right? Like not where it's really not even necessarily safe to live there. Sometimes it's plumbing issues, water issues, ceiling falling down issues. Raccoons, for some reason, seem to be one that we've encountered a lot lately. So places where people are staying where the landlord isn't maintaining the property the way the landlord should, and the tenant is unfortunately having to live in a situation that isn't healthy or livable, habitable for them. We also help people in the housing context with landlords who aren't following the rules, right? So sometimes we see situations where a landlord will just change the locks instead of going through the eviction process if the person isn't paying their rent. And landlords can't do that. And that is another issue that we would get involved with and help address that situation. And then also in the housing context, we help with housing discrimination. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in the next couple minutes. We also help people who are facing utility disconnections or denials. So advocacy, with Ameren and NICOR and the city and the town water departments, to try to make sure the rules were followed and do what we can to prevent disconnections or denials or turnoffs. I already talked a little bit about Social Security issues. We also help people with consumer debt and collection issues where income or assets that should be exempt should not be able to be taken by the creditor, are being taken, or something's going wrong with that process where really the person, if they have limited assets, limited income, shouldn't be collected from. Sometimes we see that situation where a creditor has gotten a judgment and then freezes a bank account, but the money in the bank account should be exempt because it's only Social Security income or something like that. So we'll get involved in those processes as well to make sure people's income and assets are protected the way that they should be when those income and assets are limited and really necessary, right, to be sustainable day to day. And then we also have a project helping people with criminal records relief. So sealing and expunging criminal records, healthcare waivers as well. So we have one full-time attorney and then who primarily just works in criminal record relief, providing a really big benefit to individuals to be able to seal or expunge eligible criminal records. And that really helps people be able to access housing and employment opportunities. So before I move on to a little bit about fair housing, does anyone have any questions at this point? All right. Well, I'll keep going and talk just a little bit about our fair housing work, and then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. So, so I'm the attorney that runs our Bloomington office's fair housing project. For those of you who may be less familiar with fair housing law, there's a federal Fair Housing Act, and it prohibits discrimination by housing providers on the basis of these characteristics that are listed on the screen here: disability, race, sex, color, national origin, religion, and family status. And then the law in Illinois, the Illinois Human Rights Act adds some additional categories of protection where a housing provider can't discriminate against a person because of these additional protected categories: someone's age, if they're 40 or older, their marital status, their military status, so being active military, or their discharge status, favorable or unfavorable, the status of having an order of protection, pregnancy, sexual orientation, some arrest records. So a housing provider can't, under Illinois law, can't discriminate against a person in housing if they have a record that's just an arrest, right? Or a record that has been expunged or sealed, or a juvenile record, right? So if it's a conviction, generally landlords and housing providers can use that in their analysis and determination. They still have to treat everyone the same way, right? They can't say, for a certain group of people, we're going to consider only these types of convictions, and for another group of people, we're going to consider these types of convictions, right? They have to treat everyone the same, but they can't consider convictions, but they can't consider just arrest records or records that have been expunged or sealed, or juvenile records. That would be discriminatory under Illinois law. And then this year, source of income was added as a protected category under the Illinois Human Rights Act. And so what that means is that a housing provider can't discriminate against a person for the way that they're going to pay their rent, right? So a housing provider can't require that somebody have employment income to pay their rent. They can't say, we're not going to take child support income or Social Security income, or other income that's not coming from an employment context. We see this come up a lot for persons who have housing choice vouchers, where landlords say, we won't take housing choice vouchers. Well, now under Illinois law, having a housing choice voucher, a source of income, a way that you're going to pay your rent, right, is protected. And so landlords can't discriminate against someone because they're going to use a housing choice voucher to pay their rent. And so I keep saying housing providers because that's what the law says, housing providers. So a lot of the times I'm talking about landlords, but landlords include like the property management company, the owner, the maintenance staff, anyone who works for the management company or the owner. And then also included in other contexts, right? Banks and lending institutions that are doing mortgages, real estate agents, sellers, and also public housing authorities. And so housing discrimination can show up in a lot of different ways. It includes intentional discrimination, policies that seem to apply to everyone equally, but really have a discriminatory effect on a certain group of people that's protected by the law. And then also a fair housing law violation can be mishandling a disability-related request in housing. And so I'm just going to real briefly run through a couple examples of those. So intentional discrimination can be flat out, I'm not going to rent to you because you belong in one of those protected characteristics, right? That's very straightforward, very clear. Sometimes we hear that, but we don't always, right? Sometimes it's not quite so clear what the reason is for refusing to rent, but sometimes there's other circumstances, right? Or other information that makes someone feel like they were discriminated against in their application for housing because of a protected characteristics. Like for instance, somebody who maybe has a family, right? So family status discrimination. Somebody who has a family they look at a unit, they apply, things seem okay on the phone, but then they show up, they have their kids with them. The housing provider's all of a sudden like, this unit isn't available anymore, right? But then they see that the unit is still advertised and posted and it is still really available. The housing provider, just once they learned they had kids, didn't want to rent to them, for instance. That's just one example. But intentional discrimination can be refusing to rent or really any other action that makes housing more difficult to obtain. So different application requirements, discriminatory terms and conditions in the housing, discriminatory advertising, saying to someone, I'm going to use the family status one again, saying to a family with kids, you would really be best on the ground floor, right? The first floor, to prevent overhead noise for other tenants, and trying to steer them to a particular place or a particular unit because of a protected characteristic. And then another type of discrimination under fair housing law is landlords who have policies, housing providers who have policies that seem neutral, right? Seem to apply to everyone, but really have a discriminatory effect on a group protected by fair housing law. And so this is just an example. This one we do see fairly often. And the issue is that over broad policies about criminal records or particularly arrest records really operate to have a disproportionate impact on minorities. And so sometimes we can challenge these types of policies. As I said before, housing providers can consider criminal history, but when they have really broad, really big bans, like no criminal involvement whatsoever, no arrest record, nothing, that's really discriminatory, right? Because of the effect that it has on certain groups of people. And it operates to keep those groups of people out of housing, right? And it doesn't really serve a legitimate purpose, right? If it's a more narrowly tailored policy, that the housing provider has an argument that it could serve a business interest of safety. And again, those are things that we look at when someone comes to us and says, hey, I got denied from this housing because of my arrest record, or I think it was because I have a family, or I think it was because I'm Black, or, any of these circumstances. We really take a look at it, take a look at the policies, see what the landlord's doing. And we can also do what's called fair housing testing, which is where we have testers who fictionally then go apply with that landlord. And we see how those testers are treated, right? Based on the characteristics that those testers present. And then that information that the testers gather can be additional evidence that we can use to support our client in their housing discrimination claim against the housing provider. And so that's really impactful and helpful work that we can do too, to kind of help develop and build a case. And then the other part of fair housing law and work is that persons with disabilities in housing can ask for reasonable modifications or reasonable accommodations. And so a lot of fair housing claims and cases and complaints arise out of landlords who don't handle these requests appropriately. And so the basics are that a person with a disability, which is a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activities, can ask in housing for a reasonable modification or reasonable accommodation. And so an accommodation is an adjustment, a change to the landlord's rules or policies that lessens the effects of the disability. It can't impose an undue financial burden on the landlord. So a common example of this is an emotional support animal, or a service animal, right? Where a landlord says, their lease says, no pets, like we don't allow any animals at all. Well, a person with a disability who needs, for instance, an emotional support animal to help support them with their disability, if it's, most commonly I see this with anxiety and depression, where a doctor has supported having a support animal as a way to alleviate the effects of the disability, then the person can ask their landlord for an exception to the no pets policy, and the landlord has to grant it, right? There's no real undue financial burden to letting someone have a support animal. And so a lot of the work that I do with our Fair Housing Project helps address these types of situations where someone comes and says, you know, I've asked for a support animal, but my landlord's not responding, or they said no. And we work through the process with our clients. And then a person with a disability in housing can also ask for a modification. So that's a structural change that's necessary to lessen the effects of the disability. So examples would be like a ramp or a grab bar in the shower. Now, generally speaking, the tenant is responsible for the cost unless the tenant is in some public housing and subsidized housing. Then the landlord does have to cover the cost of the modification, but usually it's at the tenant's expense. But I found that even with private landlords, we've been able to kind of negotiate and work things out, and especially with lower cost solutions, if it's grab bars or something like that, usually we're able to get it resolved one way or the other. So that's reasonable modifications is something else that I am able to help clients with in our Fair Housing Project. So what do we do with our Fair Housing Project? We, as I mentioned before, investigate complaints of housing discrimination, right? So if someone comes to us and says, I applied for housing, I got turned down, you know, here's what they told me, here's what I kind of felt, here's the circumstances, here's, you know, I talked to them on the phone and they said one thing, but then they saw me in person and they said another thing. And so I think this is because of this protected characteristic I have, or this one. We look into it, we investigate it. I talked about how we can do fair housing testing. We also assist in court or with filing a complaint of housing discrimination with HUD or the Illinois Department of Human Rights. And we assist with, as I mentioned, reasonable accommodation and modification requests, and really in conflicts with housing providers, because sometimes, you know, a housing provider gives an eviction notice, but it's really related to a fair housing issue. And we help with that through our Fair Housing Project. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Correction notice. Oh, what? Oh.
Wow, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Emily. Does anybody have any questions for Emily? It was a lot of really good information.
I see Linda's hand raised. Sorry,
Linda?
Langston. Linda
No,
Foster.
you're okay.
Yes. How you doing? And thank you so much for the presentations. And just getting back to help and the assistance that you give individuals. After you assist with individuals, do you find that the homeowners or those that are having to make the change, the exemption, do you see where the clients may find that there may be some retributions forthcoming after they have contacted your office? And if you do, what is the repercussions from that? Because we know that's still illegal as well. But you know, these individuals obviously wants to live there, but they need some type of support in order for them to habitate at their location. So are there any time that you see that those clients got to come back and say, well, they did this, but they did this?
Yeah, so it does happen, right? And as you said, Linda, it is illegal, right, for a landlord to retaliate against someone for exercising their fair housing rights, right? So, you know, a person who asks for a modification or accommodation, you know, I help them get that resolved, but then 6 months later they get, or 3 months later, 2 months later, whatever it is, they get a non-renewal of lease notice, or, you know, something that indicates the landlord's trying to do something to get them out, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I would say I don't see that as often as I had thought that I might when we started this project. A lot of times what I see is just landlords who are used to brushing people off, right? Used to brushing people off. used to saying no and hoping people go away, right? And so when I get involved, I say, we're not going to go away. Like, so you're going to have to deal with this. And then they kind of deal with it, and then it's over, right? Or they, you know, make the accommodation or the modification, and then we all move on, right? And so I see less retaliation than I thought that I would. But it does happen, and it's an actionable claim in and of itself, right? Where I could help a client file a complaint or a court case to get damages for retaliation. The thing that I see that I think is unfortunate is people who apply for housing and then they're turned down because of a protected characteristic. You know, sometimes I can try to jump in pretty quickly to tell the housing provider they're wrong and try to get the person in with that housing provider. But a lot of times the person says, I don't want to live there anymore, right? Because of the way that they treated me or made me feel because of who I am, right? And so I think that's really unfortunate. And that doesn't mean the person, you know, still doesn't have a complaint they can file or a court case and get damages. But trying to get them into that particular housing, a lot of times my clients say, I'm not interested anymore because of the way that that person treated me. So I have seen that fairly often now too.
Really?
Does anyone have any other questions about Prairie State or about our fair housing work?
Okay, that's good.
Well, thanks for letting me present, and feel free to reach out at any time with any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. We really appreciate it. You know, housing is always a huge barrier, especially for people with felony convictions. You know, that was one of the things that was just so hard for me along my journey was finding someone that would rent to me. And you know, it was crazy because there were property management companies that would legit tell me, like, no, we won't rent to you because of your felony conviction, and it's because, you know, it's manufacturing with the intent to deliver. Like, they would tell me because of my drug case, you know, they just wouldn't rent to me. And so if, you know, you have to live somewhere, but your background, you know, can really hurt that. No matter how good a job you have, how many W-2s you have, your credit score, like, you can check all these boxes, but because you have this felony conviction, that's just it's one of our number one barriers that we have. So we absolutely appreciate the work that you guys do to help people in that situation. And I always like to remind you guys, me personally, I'm the owner of a moving company, Team Relocation, and we've been honored to do some work with you guys before. Every now and then we're able to do some pro bono work for evictions. Obviously, when people you know, are losing stuff, then they still got to get what they, you know, respectfully get what they can and get out. And sometimes that can be hard if they can't physically do it. They don't have the funds to hire movers, and normally it's not a lot of stuff. So, you know, we like being able to work with you guys. If ever, you know, those types of situations come up, we're able to do a couple of them a year. So
That's great. Yeah, thank you for the reminder on that, because that is such a huge huge need that is hard, especially if someone has some limitations where they're not able to physically move
yeah.
belongings. So thank you.
Well, thank you for being here, Emily. I know Sarah already logged off. We just want to thank Sarah and the Normal Police Department for, you know, all of their great information as well. And if anybody at this time, you know, before we get out of here and get on with our Friday and our weekend, does anybody have, you know, just any reminders, any announcements, any other questions while we're here?
Langston,
I
I
see
just
they
wanted to,
put that in the chat. Oh, was you gonna say something about the housing survey?
yes,
Go
the
ahead.
survey, but Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to mention that McLean County having a housing survey up until November 27. I think it's about 23 questions you can do online. You can go to the government center, and they do have a hard copy if necessary. But please encourage everybody to fill out that survey.
Yeah.
Submit it, and you can do it right online, right from your phone.
Absolutely. That's a great idea. Okay. All right, you guys. I thank you all for joining us this month, and we'll look forward to just seeing everybody back next month. If there's someone that you can think of to invite, to join us next month, or someone that you feel like would be a good resource to share or be a speaker, feel free to send them our way, and we'll get them lined up for a following meeting. And I hope you guys all have a good weekend, and we'll see you next time. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Langston.
Great information.
Yes.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye. And happy Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Happy
Yes,
Thanksgiving.
yes.
Absolutely. In the way, bro, because I had to like facilitate the meeting.